Carrie, am I looking at this right, where it seems like there's still quite a few people that need to actually get on the call portion?
That's correct. There's a few people that are logged in to the computer portion that are probably calling in.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll get started in about 2 minutes. We still have several folks getting into the call portion of the meeting. We'll get started in about 2 minutes. Thanks for your patience. All right, good morning and welcome. My name is Lacey Leone McLaughlin. I am the Director of Executive Education and Sponsor Relations here at the Center. Before we get started with John, Ravin, and Ian, there are a couple of administrative tests that I want to go over. But again, I'd like to welcome you, and you're in for a very exciting hour with our 3 hosts today. As a reminder, all listener lines will be muted. If you want to speak, you have 2 options. You can use the raise hand bar in the middle of your page, or you can type a question or comment in the right side bottom corner dialog box that you'll be seeing on your page. Carrie, our moderator, will be integrating those questions into the conversation at appropriate stops, so she will help make sure that your questions and raised hand button are seen as soon as possible and it makes sense within the presentation. A PDF of the slide deck and a recording of the webinar will be available. You'll be getting a URL sent to you from Carrie and I with our names with a link to get to those documents. It does take about 3 days for those documents to become available. So in about 3 days, you should expect to see an email from the center with that information. As a reminder, we do have upcoming seminars and webinars. The one that I want to make sure that you pay particular attention to is the one that is related to the content you'll be hearing today. The Future of HR is going to be hosted by Towers Watson in Chicago, with John, Ian, and Ravin leading the program with several amazing guest speakers that you can see from several great organizations. So if you're interested, we still do have spots available, and again, that program is happening August 25th through the 26th. In Chicago. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to the office or Carrie directly. At this point, I'd like to introduce our 3 speakers for today. First, I'll start with John Boudreau. John is a professor at the USC Marshall School of Business, and he's also the research director at the Center for Effective Organization. John focuses on all areas of human capital, and talent and sustainable competitive advantage. John has also been working on the release of an upcoming book that I'll mention when I introduce Ravin. Ravin is the Managing Director and Global Practice Leader at Towers Watson. He has been recognized as a top 25 consultant by Consulting Magazine. He is also the co-author of the upcoming soon-to-be-released book that him and John partnered with on called Transformative HR, and it's soon to be released. And lastly, I'd like to introduce Ian Ziskin. Ian Ziskin is the executive in residence at the center, and he's also the president of Exec Excel Group. Ian is also the former head of HR at Northrop Grumman and Quest Communications. With that, I'd like to turn it over to John, Ian, and Ravin to get us started.
Thank you, Lacey. I think I'll be beginning on behalf of my colleagues here. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm delighted to have a chance to join Ian and Ravin here to talk about some of the work we've been doing over the last year or so, and the basis of, as Lacey said, the upcoming program that the three of us are going to put together in October in Chicago. In August rather, in Chicago, excuse me, early in the day here in LA. So let me get things started. What we're going to do today is provide you with some ideas that have emerged from two streams of work, essentially. One of them we've been calling the Future of HR project. That's a project that's been going on at the center probably for about 5 years, maybe a little bit more, primarily but not exclusively driven by Ian and me and our work together. And that has produced a consortium of about 30 chief HR officers and thought leaders that have been working as volunteers to map the future of the profession. That's what this slide that you see on the screen now will deal with. As we move through the presentation today, we're also going to tee up one of the fundamental themes of this work on the future of HR, which has to do with the nature of how work arrangements and work relationships are changing. And that is the subject of the book that Ravin and I have co-authored along with our colleague David Creelman. So as we go through, you'll see kind of a shift and a mixture of those two themes, the evolution of HR and how to create a step change in the profession so that it's ready to meet its potential. And then one of the themes beneath that is this idea of the changing nature of work and work relationships. So on this slide, I've just given you a quick brief about what sort of motivated the Future of HR project. It began with a manifesto from Scott Bataski, who's now the head of HR at Starbucks, basically saying the profession just isn't progressing in the way that he and others would like to see. We then began to do some interviews with folks who said there really is potentially a break between where HR is going and where it needs to be going in the future. A number of very, very prominent, very successful CHROs beginning to have conversations with me and with Ian and others to say we need to do something about the future of HR. There is a significant potential disconnect between where we need to be and where we'll go. The middle graph kind of shows that graphically. I wouldn't say that the curve is going to go down on the right, but the idea was that if HR is progressing, and it'll continue to progress, but that its demands are going to grow exponentially. So if you look out over time, well, we're going to keep progressing and we're doing well. There was an increasing sense that there'd be a huge gap between what HR will be ready to do and its aspirations and its potential. One of my favorite stories indicated by the Dilbert cartoon is one of a CEO introducing his leadership team, introducing marketing, finance, operations, and for each one of them having an eloquent reason how that function would assist the organization in winning. When they turned to HR, they said, and now let me tell you how HR will assist us in winning, and they paused, not really knowing what to say. And the CEO said, HR, why don't you tell us what you're going to do? That's a story that didn't come from just an entry-level HR person, but from one of the top VPs of HR in the world, and a lot of heads nodding around the desk. Another metaphor was that, well, because the great organizations are building great HR. I believe it was Eva Sage Gavin, indicated down on the left by the campfire picture. Eva Sage Gavin said, we're each building great campfires, but they don't coalesce into the bonfire that would move the whole profession, that would substantially change the ability of the profession to deliver on its needs. And then finally, there was a good deal of discussion about potentially a broken pipeline of talent for HR, that the kinds of talent development that has happened in the past, the sorts of things that we're developing and measuring and assessing now may not get us to the place where the leaders need to be in the future. All of this then became a kind of motivating set of ideas for the first consortium. You can turn the slide now. Thank you, Carrie. And that consortium got together about a little over a year ago, and we worked the year before that to say, well, how would we codify and how would we express this need for a step change in the profession, this realization that while the profession is advancing, it needs to move quicker. And the group came up with 4 themes that you will begin to see emerging in the work that we'll present to you today and that we'll talk about at depth in the program in Chicago. The first one was the idea of aligning HR with value creation, having a model about how HR helps organizations win. That goes back to that CEO idea a little bit, where we don't have a common framework that helps us understand what it is about great HR that creates organizations that win and create strategic success. So that was one group. Another group was improve the expectations of HR's constituents and align them more properly with HR's potential. The idea that this can't just be an HR project, it needs to look at our customers. The third one, which we won't talk about too much today, but is coming later, has to do with rewiring the work of HR, rewiring the tools, perhaps to be more net savvy, rewiring the operating models in our organization structure so that it fits more of a modern organization, rewiring the way we think about the functions and how they interact, maybe more like a supply chain and less like recruitment plus staffing plus deployment, et cetera. And then finally, at the bottom, an agenda to ensure the HR talent pipeline, which I mentioned. The idea of looking at the competencies we assess, the experience that HR leaders have, and really asking ourselves, how can we create more of a pipeline for the kinds of HR roles that will exist in the future? And as we go through the program today, you'll see these themes emerge, and again, we'll use as an underlying motivator this idea of changing work relationships and the changing nature of work. So with that, I'm going to ask my colleague Ian Ziskin, who has been my co-leader in the Future of HR project really since its beginning, to talk to us a little bit about what our group of volunteer teams came up with as they began to look at those 4 agendas that I just laid out for you. So Ian, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. One of the really exciting aspects of this project and working with these teams on the various work streams that John was just referring to was the realization that, for example, this first team focusing on HR's role in creating value and ultimately helping organizations win, you have to start with external context, understanding the environment around us outside of HR and what some of the implications for that are, which actually ultimately led to some really interesting work on 5 forces of change, which you can imagine began being a much longer list than 5 forces, but the group began so things that
Ian, I think we're losing you here and there. Lacey or Carrie,
can you hear me, John?
That?
Hold on a second. Can you hear me a little bit better now?
Much better. Thank you, Ian.
All right, let's try that. Sorry about that, folks. So what I want to do is touch briefly on each of these 5 forces just to give you a sense of context and some of the external things that are having an impact on the way that work is getting done and changes to the workforce and the workplace. Maybe let's start with technology change. So if you think about examples, let's just use the computer industry as an example of exponential change and disruption that's taken place over a number of years as we've switched from mainframes to laptops to desktops to handheld devices to wearable devices to now ultimately ingestible devices and injectable devices into the human body. It's a great metaphor for the not only fairly rapid but fairly dramatic changes in technology that have a huge impact on virtually the way all of us do business. One of my favorite factoids related to technology change is that it's been said the internet has created 2.6 jobs for every job that it has destroyed. And that's good news, but the problem, of course, is that there's almost a complete disconnect between the jobs that are being created, often very technologically based, and available labor, people who have the skill set to actually do the jobs that are available and being created. So that's one big theme that we're spending time worrying about and its impact on HR. A second one has to do with social and organizational reconfiguration. This is about the increasing democratization of work, the increasing flexibility of work in terms of where it gets done, when it gets done, how it gets done, with whom we choose to work, and the rest. It also has a very significant connection to the erosion of the traditional employment model, which John and Ravin are going to spend some time talking about during this webinar. The connected world, increasingly, of course, more mobile, more virtual. Social media is becoming essentially the way that work gets done. And as a result of that, much more immediacy, much more transparency, much more openness to information, what happens, when it happens, and how quickly everyone knows about it, both good and bad. In terms of the talent market, this is the realization of moving full force into the fourth-generation workforce and how distributed work is becoming, the skills mismatch that often exists between the jobs that are available and the labor that's available to work on it. It's an increasing emphasis on marketing-related principles, which we've seen in many ways happen as part of the future of HR work. We'll come back to a little bit later in the webinar. Things such as segmentation and mass custom on the workplace. And then this very interesting notion of human and machine collaboration, or some people might say conflict, where we're recognizing the introduction of analytics and algorithms and automation into the workplace, the advent of big data, which everybody talks about, but what we're talking about less and need to talk about more is how to make sense of all of this big data in order to develop insights that lead to good, relevant, business-driven actions. And then lots of examples of machines beginning to take over tasks that humans used to do, or increasingly, like the example perhaps of Uber being one example, where machines are actually increasingly directing the work of humans. And if you're a driver for Uber and you're getting next assignment from computers, not from human beings, this is one example of how human-machine collaboration is beginning to change the world of work in big ways. And if Carrie, if you switch us over to the next chart, what I want to do is build on this theme a little bit by saying that if you boiled all of these 5 forces of change down, almost everything we're talking about falls into a couple of core categories. One is this increasing democratization of work that I just mentioned, and the second one has to do with technological empowerment, transforming completely the way that work is getting done. Now, interestingly enough, this has led to some great discussion in our Future of HR teams that have been doing some work about 4 potential scenarios that most companies might find themselves in using the democratization of work and technological empowerment as a bit of a matrix. You know, will your business find itself in a scenario where things are pretty much consistent with current state? In other words, things haven't changed all that much. That's a possibility. Another potential scenario is that things look similar to today, but they're
turbocharged a bit. You know, you've got a bit more impact of technological empowerment. You've got a slight increase in the democratization of work, but not dramatically so. Another potential quadrant that you and your organization might find yourselves in is what our team ended up calling work reimagined, where the democratization of work, the flexibility with which work is being done and delivered substantially changes and increases, but technology has a minimal impact on the way that the work is being done. And then perhaps a fourth quadrant being what we ended up calling Uber empowered, meaning that the democratization of work becomes substantially higher, greater, and different than it is today over the next 10 years. And the impact of technology in how work gets done in your company and in your industry also dramatically changes and increases. And the reason we focused on this four-quadrant set of scenarios is the recognition that every company is coming from a different place and is heading to a different place at a different pace and speed of change. And being able to predict your own future, if you will, and modify it in a way that makes sense for you and the evolution of your business turns out to be a fairly important way of thinking about this as we go forward over the next 10 years. What we want to do now to build on some of these themes that we're talking about as context is to take you into some of the new work that John and Ravin have been doing, John mentioned as part of their new book, that begins to bring some of these notions home in a much more specific way. So I'm going to turn it back over to John for that.
Thanks, Ian. Carrie, why don't you leave it on the slide before for just a second? I'll just segue a bit. So what you're seeing, if you're listening in the audience, and I know we have a variety of folks, some of whom were involved in the project and whom weren't, you're seeing how a group of that 30 volunteer HR leaders divided up into a couple of teams got their arms around the notion of this, the charter of HR, the alignment of HR with organizations that win. What they did was they went and said, well, that logic model has to look at the forces of change in the environment. It has to look at the nature of how businesses will respond and organizations will respond to those forces. And we need to begin to develop maps that leaders, along with their HR leaders, could use to see how many of these trends are going to affect them. The trends that you see on the left were derived from a fairly significant reading of a lot of different published sources in terms of what's expected in the future. So as Ian said, while this isn't expected to be the specific future for every single organization, that is, that we can predict where everybody's going to be, what we saw very clearly as the groups did their interviews and their focus groups was that these themes do seem to apply to everyone at different levels, and there's a migration model. There's a map, such as the one you see here, that would be a tool for organizations to start to have these discussions. Where are we? Which of these is going to affect us the most? And to use that as a way to start to articulate what great HR could do to make that happen. Okay, Carrie, now if you want to move to the next one. I'm going to segue now to the other theme of the day, which is obviously quite related to this one. One of the underlying dynamics that is causing the nature, those trends to happen, that is causing the impact of those trends on organizations, has to do with this evolution of new work arrangements. Ian mentioned Uber. There's obviously been a great deal of controversy lately about whether Uber drivers are employees or contractors. California ruling that one particular driver was indeed an employee of Uber, with billion-dollar implications if every one of their hundreds of thousands of drivers were determined to be an employee. So there has been a good deal of controversy recently in this idea of whether this new work, whether we call it contracting, whether it comes through freelancing, whether it comes through a different kind of employment relationship, perhaps more temporary, whether it's horrible or wonderful. And I won't go through all the bullets here, but you've all heard the debates. On the left side, we have all the reasons why new work arrangements like freelance platforms and outsourcing and contracting and free agents, why that might be exploitive to workers. On the right-hand side, we have a number of counter-arguments about how it could be wonderful in terms of giving workers a transportable career, a boundaryless career, much more precise worker matching according to a McKinsey report, et cetera. So this theme that there are emerging, these new, we might call them more democratic or more open work arrangements that are alternatives to employment, is one of, not the only one, but one of the key driving factors in the future of HR work that this group of volunteers has come up with. Now, the new work idea happens to be the theme of a book that Ravin and David Creelman and I were writing as we were doing the future of HR work as well. So I want to now incorporate this idea of new work arrangements into our discussion. And what I'd like to do is ask Ravin to take you through the framework that he and I and David used in the book to begin to help leaders think this through, and some examples of how the new work looks that may be surprising for you. Ravin?
Great. Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. So if we go to that next slide as we have it, one of the things that we tried to do with Lead the Work is to transcend all of the anecdotes and interesting examples and shiny objects, as John would call them, that we see and hear every day into, is there a framework with which we could actually make some sense of some of these fairly significant changes that we're seeing along the lines of what John talked about on the last slide. And as we've looked at it, we think there are three dimensions against which these changes have been taking place. The first being, if you think of the assignment or the work, and if you think of a continuum of choice with the traditional of a job, of employment, of organization, of the organization being on one side of the continuum and workers being on the other. When you think of the assignment, can we deconstruct a job into discrete activities which, with the power of technology, allow us to then disperse those activities to their most efficient, lowest cost means of getting it done? If you think of what talent platforms like Topcoder or Elance and Tongle and others have done, how far could we detach that particular set of activities which have now been deconstructed and dispersed from the traditional confines of employment? Cue some of the Uber challenges that John has just talked about. The next set of choices really align around the organization. If you think of our organizations today, largely self-contained in terms of all the functions within an organization, fairly detached from other entities, fairly insular with lots of concerns and protections around the mobility of work and workers, protection of intellectual property, and the org structure itself is fairly rigid. Or alternatively, might we have a much more permeable organization through which work and workers sort of flow somewhat more seamlessly? Could that organization be interlinked with others in a sort of construct along the lines of what we might call collaborative production? Think of the sort of a company version of Divvy bikes or Zip cars, sharing talent in similar fashion. How deeply could organizations collaborate in a construct like that? And how much flexibility could we have to flex the org structure so that as work and workers move in and out of the organization, the actual functions that exist within the organization become equally flexible? And then the third dimension becomes, would be the rewards. If you think of the traditional set of rewards that we might have, they're fairly permanent in construct with a long tail. If you think about defined benefit and defined benefit plans and some of the retiree medical programs, fairly collective and consistent across the workforce, and somewhat traditional in the sense that many of these haven't really changed over the course of the last 30, 40, 50 years. But as you think of the new work, how small could we make the time frame in terms of getting the reward to be as closely related to the time the work is performed, given that we've deconstructed that work from an intact job into more minute sets of activities? How specifically could we individualize that set of rewards so that we've got a set of rewards that optimize the value exchange with a particular individual as opposed to attempting to sort of fit that square peg into a round hole, or vice versa? And how creative might the rewards be? As we've done our research in writing Lead the Work, the understanding the trade-offs that talent on a particular platform might make between compensation today versus reputation for tomorrow that then keys off of career wealth in the future. So that opportunity, that reputation becomes, in a sense, that defined benefit plan of the future, if that makes sense, because the opportunity is where this is, or rather the security is how the emanates from the provision of opportunity, if that makes sense. So some interesting variables and I think choice points as we think of the continuums of the assignment, the organization, and the rewards. And one specific example, if we go to the next slide, I'll say if we think of those three as being continuums, I think what JetBlue has done has been not in the more radical end of the continuum, but certainly a very, very creative way of reimagining a set of jobs and an organization construct that is probably very familiar to us. And specifically, the fairly impressive work that they did with their call center, which used to be located in Queens. All of the traditional challenges of a call center that you might expect, pretty high turnover, located in a high-cost area, challenges of ensuring the quality and consistency with which the work was done. And the innovative solution was to say, well, instead of having people come to work in this single location, how about we take the work and disperse it to where we can actually recruit the ideal talent that's required for this particular type of work. And long story short, what they did was to create a virtual call center, actually went specifically to talent that was located in Salt Lake City, because you've got a very educated population of stay-at-home moms with young children who are looking for work between the hours of, let's say, 8 and 4, but didn't have the ability to sort of work outside of the home. And so JetBlue, with its technology, was able to access an underserved pool of exceptional talent and realize what was a truly unique win-win of engaging this pool of talent on a cost-effective basis, significantly reducing by several hundredfold the turnover rates that they'd had, significantly reducing the cost of operating that call center, and significantly increasing what had been pretty decent productivity levels with the physical center, but increasing those several-fold as well. And I think it was a great example for us as we were writing Lead the Work of the step change in performance and capability, not just for the organization, but the win-win in terms of engaging key talent pools that's possible with some alternative ways of thinking about work and workers. John, I think it's back to you now.
Thanks, Ravin. So just to continue this, so, following along then, as you saw, we have this one project that came up with these two ideas, democratization of work. We're seeing a part of that here, the changing nature of work relationships. Work becomes much more cloud-based, much less organization-focused, much more in the hands of the workers. And then the idea of technological empowerment, the notion that technology often does support this, and the fact that you can have the two of them working together, or one of them working at a time. So as we saw in Ravin's example, one of our three dimensions in the book on this idea of new work arrangements, democratization we might call it, was the assignment, with the agents being dispersed and breaking the task down so that it could work with stay-at-home moms. A second dimension of our model is the organization. And the idea that it becomes more permeable, it links up with other organizations, you collaborate differently. And the example, the sort of diagram we use in the book is to say that an organization goes from a place that contains the employees, and that's where we get our work done if you look on the left, to thinking of an organization as more a place that organizes work, not employees, that it organizes talent. This has come up a lot in the Future of HR project as well, with the idea, as Ian will talk about later, that this suggests a whole set of new capabilities in this arena that we might call HR. Once you take the word employment out of HR, what does engagement mean if it's about organizing a work cloud, for example? What does employee turnover mean, et cetera? So one kind of fundamental concept that we had was we need to think of the organization as differentially permeable. And then the second one is we need to think about the functions inside the organization as also movable. The pharmaceutical organizations, for example, have begun to pool their resources to create R&D that exists outside of any one organization, but is connected to all of them. And again, you can see the implications for HR topics like organization design, org development, and really the fundamental meaning of the organization. If we'll turn to the next slide, please, Carrie, if you would. One of the favorite examples that we ran across in the book of this idea of making the organization more permeable, more interlinked, more collaborative was something that didn't involve changing employment at all. In other words, all the people involved remained traditional employees of their organizations. Siemens created a hearing aid for children. Now, their task was then to market that hearing aid. The typical approach would probably be that they would look to their own marketers, their own employees, and say, please market the hearing aid. But Siemens is very, very good at a lot of things, elevators, monorails, et cetera, not necessarily marketing to kids. Siemens did a great thing. In the theme of lead the work in the book, instead of thinking about what employees could do the work, Siemens stepped back and said, where are the best employees to do this work? They realized that if they tried to recruit marketers for children, the best of them would probably say, I love what you do, Siemens, and you're a great company, but I prefer to work at Disney. Well, Siemens formed a partnership with Disney to borrow the Disney marketers to help market the hearing aid that Siemens built for children. In other words, Disney and Siemens had to make each of their boundaries more permeable, make them more flexible. And the result, Carrie, if you want to turn to the next slide, please, was this kind of marketing approach, the Disney Kit, a storybook about a heroine or a hero who has a difference from other kids, et cetera. So you get the idea. Something that while Siemens has great marketers, probably wouldn't have emerged in quite this form or with quite this level of quality and insight if they hadn't thought to reframe the question. Instead of asking which of our employees can market this hearing aid, or how can we recruit people to market this hearing aid, they stepped back and they said, in our words, what if we lead the work? Where are the best people to do this? And rather than compete with Disney, why don't we find a way to collaborate with Disney? So the idea there is that underlying this idea of democratization at work is this notion of a framework where HR leaders and other leaders can start to think beyond just employment as a way to get work done and start to see options they might not have seen before. And Carrie, if you want to move to the next one. The final dimension of the model that Ravin, David, and I put together in the book is this notion of the reward. And as Ravin said, when we look at the reward going forward, this theme of work democratization, technological empowerment, means that a whole array of rewards are going to be available to employees, and therefore they're going to be demanded or at least discussed when they come to organizations. I like this example. It's one that I've used a number of times of a group of gamers who solved a riddle, a biochemistry riddle about how to attack the AIDS virus by playing a game. The game is called Fold It, and it has to do with folding structures so that they perform in certain ways. The storyline is that there was a biochemistry problem that had eluded scientists for years, eluded supercomputers for years, and someone had the great idea to put that problem out in the form of a version of this game called Fold It. And they enlisted then thousands and thousands of gamers all over the world competing to find the best structure of a protein to fit into the AIDS virus. And the result was a breakthrough in the scientific answer, so much so that the scientific paper reporting it had Fold It game teams as co-authors. Now, what does that have to do with this theme of today? If we think about the combination of technological empowerment and work democracy and rewards, the reward for this work, none of the gamers got paid. None of the gamers was an employee of any of the companies that benefited from this. Instead, the reward was the glory and the reputation and the bragging rights of being the one to solve this problem and being listed as an author on the scientific paper. So as leaders generally, and HR leaders in particular, begin to think about these implications, our theme here is that we'll need to be thinking more creatively about rewards, maybe even something as significant as reputation and authorship and bragging rights becomes a substitute in this case for more traditional rewards like money, benefits, etc. It's also interesting that if you wanted to find the few people in the world that could solve this problem, again, lots of biochemist employees had tried it, lots of supercomputer employees had tried it, to find the few that could solve it, you probably can't rely on employment, because the chance that you could actually recruit the few people in the world that could do it, or that they necessarily want to work for you, is pretty low. But getting it out there to the community through technology, through a democratized work arrangement, managed to solve this problem. And so I'll have Ravin continue then on this idea of platforms and their implications for how work will change in the future.
Great, thanks, John. If you think back to the two core themes that Ian talked about of the democratization of work and technology empowerment, or technological empowerment, I can't think of anything that sort of better captures the power of those two themes than just the explosion of growth that we've seen with talent platforms. And there's a piece of research that just came out from the folks at McKinsey that went back and looked at the potential for these talent platforms to actually transform the global economy. And by their predictions, by 2025, there'll be another $2.7 trillion in global GDP added. I think it's worth just looking at, what the building blocks for that estimate are. And if you think for a moment of, Ian talked about Uber, equally you could think about Topcoder that some of you may be familiar with. Topcoder has gone from having some 6,000 technologists on their platform 10 years ago when they were first founded to now having some close to 700,000 people, 700,000 data scientists, developers, infrastructure specialists operating off of this platform. And the sources of that 2.7 trillion are, if you think of shifting our frames of reference again from organizations, jobs, and employees to work and workers and skills, improved productivity from that better matching of the particular work with the skills needed to get that work done. The reduced informality, if you think of the friction costs associated with hiring an individual for a job in your organization, the requirements for that person to do that job are fundamentally different from someone working off of a talent platform, executing a particular discrete set of tasks for you. Much greater employment through, again, to that point of friction points, much faster matches between an activity and a particular skill, which is inherently much easier to do than matching a job to an employee. And newer matches, the ability to sort of actually identify newer points of connection for a particular activity, new types of skills that may be required to execute that activity. And I think certainly the most significant one, which I think is where the technology comes into play, is much higher labor force participation, which is something that we've talked about at length in this country. And the ability for the technology to actually disperse that work to where the talent is most available. When John and I, with the rest of our colleagues at Towers Watson and Oxford Economics and a couple of sponsor organizations conducted the Talent 2021 research with Oxford Economics, one of the things we found, as some of you may recall, were the friction points, the emerging friction points in the supply and demand for talent globally across some 48 countries. And what the democratization of work and technology empowerment allows us to do is transcend those friction points by dispersing the work to where that particular skill may lie and where the best available skill to perform a particular activity may come from. So some significant potential for this explosion of talent platforms. And one of those platforms, if we go to the next slide, Carrie, we talked about Uber being a platform that enables that to happen, talked about topcoder.com. Another that is growing very quickly is a platform called Upwork. Upwork is the combination of Elance and Odesk that has been renamed, and is an organization of truly impressive scale. As we wrote Lead the Work, John, David, and I had the privilege of interacting with their leaders, as well as some of the folks who work on that platform. And as you'll see on the slide, you've got the quantum of skills that are available, as well as the number of individuals, some 10 million freelancers using this platform. The ability of this platform to provide access to our organizations for the world-class talent at price points that are fundamentally different and much more efficient than anything we could ever contemplate through a traditional employment model is I think, mind-blowing. And I think it's worth asking the question, as you look at the evolution of these talent platforms, will the best talent in your organization be the folks who are your employees, or are they more likely to be the individuals whose skills you access through a talent platform like this, who are available to you when you need them for the specific type of work that you need them to perform? So I think, again, lots of opportunity here and potentially transformative impact on our organizations. If we go to the next slide, Kerry, one of the things that we will spend a fair bit of time in the session in Chicago talking about is, I think many will recognize the arrows that circle, that go around this visual. It's our variant of the talent life cycle. I think all of us have our own little variants, but we found the talent life cycle to continue to be relevant as a framing mechanism for how we think about connecting the work we've done in Lead the Work and the future of HR. If we shift our frame of reference, as we've said a couple of times now, from jobs and organizations and employees to work and workers, and what you'll see are the outcomes associated with this sort of new and enhanced talent life cycle, or this refocused talent life cycle of engagement, leadership, diversity, performance, and culture, being enabled by how we might think about the assignment, the reward, and the organization. So as we get into the session in Chicago, we'll drill into these with some very specific examples, and some of them you've already seen over the course of the last few slides. So, John, I think, do I hand it back to you at this point?
So I think with that theme, I'll just give you, Kerry, just go back one. I'll just give you one example, and hopefully you're beginning to see the sort of organization and the reason Ian and Ravin and I are so excited about bringing this together and having this session in Chicago in August. The themes we've seen are that we have these forces of change, democratization, technological empowerment. They suggest a very different approach to work that won't affect everybody equally, but seems to be coming and seems to be growing. This notion of leading the work, not just the employees. And here we've introduced the idea that not only does it have implications for organizations, but by extension and maybe even more centrally, it has implications for the very fundamental way that we think about HR and our role as HR professionals. And that's kind of where we're turning now, and I'll have Ian talk about that in just a moment. So, Kerry, if you move on to the next one, just to give you one quick example, Ravin has mentioned Topcoder, which is a sub-company of Aperio, that is a platform for coders, none of whom are employees of Topcoder, but who get jobs through the platform. And an interesting question is, I was struck by Aperio being voted the best place to work in the UK. Now, they have about 700 employees in the UK, but they have now well over 700,000 community members globally that do their coding work. The question, I think, for Aperio is, do I want their officers to be the best, to create the best place to work for the 700 employees, or for the 700,000 coders? And the answer, of course, is those leaders in their HR organization need to think about engaging a community of 700,000, not just the 700 people that show up on the books as employees. I think that's a microcosm of one of the many ways that a fundamental concept in HR, in this case engagement, changes in this new future. It changes the nature of leadership. It changes the nature of what we mean by a career. It changes the nature of what we mean by the talent supply chain. All of those things are coming in different levels to different organizations. And what we're doing in Chicago is bringing that together with speakers who have experienced this, CHROs and others, firsthand, to help us all understand it better. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ian to kind of conclude for us and talk about some of the findings from the Future of HR project and Ian and my own work together that seem to be defining, the start of defining what this new HR and organization capability might look like. So Ian?
Thank you, John. And building on what's been said already, maybe thinking about what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes as bringing you inside the sausage factory a bit, watching the sausage be made, because there are going to be a couple of different lenses through which we look at the future expected capabilities, which will ultimately, as we move into the next phase of our project, need to be reconciled a bit more. This chart that you see in front of you now obviously has a lot on it. I'm going to focus on a few aspects of it specifically in the time that we've got available. Think of it primarily in two ways. One, as a migration map. What are the things that we as HR leaders, and then beyond HR, need to bring in other capabilities as well, need to be good at, better at, over the course of the next 10 years as we look out into the future. That's point one. Point two is thinking through these capabilities as not necessarily all being resident specifically within the HR function, but rather having the ability to reach out beyond HR to orchestrate solutions that correspond to the things that we're talking about here. Essentially, if you think about all of the themes we've been covering up to this point, one of our teams that's been working with us on the Future of HR project that was zeroing in on the talent pipeline for HR to be relevant in the future began to identify essentially 5 areas of capability that we need to be increasingly better at over time. One has to do with trend forecasting and change leadership and the migration toward more of a business leadership mentality and perhaps less of a simply pure business acumen mentality. The second one has to do with talent sourcing and community building, where if you're just building on the concepts that John and Ravin have been talking about in terms of leading the work, the ability to reach out and source talent and build communities of talent, whether they happen to reside in your own organization or outside the walls of your organization. A third area of capability going forward is around organization and performance architecture, and this starts to take us into the notions of personalization that we've talked about several times, and focusing on networks that go well beyond the performance architecture of a specific organization. A fourth area is culture and community activism, trying to create the shift, not only focusing on employment brand, but the overall experience that the employee encounters in dealing with your organization and the culture, and this blend of purpose, not just culture, but purpose and the alignment between the organization's purpose and the individual sense of purpose and whether in fact they match. And then the final, maybe least sexy, but still equally important area is around operational excellence. There still is a bunch of HR work fundamentally that has to be delivered to the organization in as effective and efficient way as possible. And what are the things we're going to do to continue to morph the operating model, the delivery model, notions of shared services, centers of excellence, business partnership, and the way that we deliver services to employees will continue to evolve. These are some of the things that our team focusing on the evolution of the talent pipeline began to address. And if we move to the next chart, one of the things that we've found increasingly fascinating, particularly for John and myself, who've been at this for a few years, is going back a few years ago when we started our Future of HR work. Some of you may be familiar with the 6 original themes that we identified at that time. It's not my intention to go into these in great detail today, other than to say that the notions of moving more toward the concepts of collective leadership and agile co-creativity, the move toward personal value proposition, and the use increasingly of segmentation, these marketing-related principles to solve people-related problems. The increasing importance of corporate social responsibility and sustainability and purpose, and the move toward education through analytics rather than over-relying on the history of HR's approach to things, which is more about persuasion through passion and relationships and sense of importance rather than telling a story or making the sale of an idea based on good data, good analytics. These are all things that over the course of these last few years are becoming increasingly consistent, increasingly crystallized as we build the story around the future of HR. On the next chart, what I wanted to do is build on that concept even further, because one of our teams has been helping us think through what are the implications for not only the capabilities, but the way that the work needs to be organized and orchestrated in order for HR to be relevant in the future. And I'll just touch on each of these 5 things very briefly to give you a sense of where things are headed. The organizational engineer is this notion of being expert in the new ways of working that we've been talking about, the effectiveness of virtual teams, and this new employment model, the erosion of the employment model traditionally that John and Ravin have been talking about, and the new ways of working that they've been describing. Organizational engineers would need to be expert at those things. The culture architect is all about the connection between culture and purpose of the organization and providing that appeal directly to the individual who cares about a particular thing that's of great importance to them. The talent scout and coach is somebody who's going to be responsible for talent identification, but also matching talent, both internal and external, to the organization with the task, in some cases bite-sized tasks that need to be addressed. The platforms, the projects, the capabilities that are required to deliver the work. The data integrator is somebody who increasingly sees around corners, understands how to forecast what's going to happen, makes sense of all of the big data that's being thrown at us and the analytics that are required to make it happen. And then one that to me is really resonating loud and clear, because I think currently it's not a strength for most HR people, is social policy and community activists, which is really about the role HR is increasingly playing in corporate social responsibility and sustainability on influencing and shaping public policy that has an impact on our organizations, on engaging in communities external to our own internal organizations with a decided emphasis on external perspective, because most HR people that I tend to interact with, while they're terrific in a number of ways, one common shortcoming is they don't really know enough about what's happening in the world around them outside of their own company and their own industry. So this issue of external perspective, increasingly important. And the final point I think we'll make if we move on to the next chart, that we'd like you to keep in mind as you're thinking about all of these evolving trends, is HR as an orchestra conductor, bringing together, orchestrating solutions to large, complex, multidisciplinary, cross-functional kinds of concepts, which means by definition the comfort with and the capability to reach out beyond the boundaries of HR economics, engineering, finance, marketing, supply chain, the list goes on, to partner with those organizations or to even embed them in some ways of HR. That's where we see it heading.
Thanks. Yeah, we lost a little bit of that last part, but I think people get the idea of the notion of not needing to be able to do everything or be an expert at everything, but the ability to pull an orchestra together and get the best out of each part that's necessary. Kind of a fundamental shift, certainly in the way many HR organizations think about their work. So we hope we've intrigued you with the integration of these 2 themes at the Center for Effective Organization, the work on the future of HR, and also the work on this nature of a shift from work to from employment to work. I'll thank Ravin and Ian for that, and then come back now to Lacey and Carrie and see if you want to see if there are questions or if we should bring it to a close.
Yeah, John, we actually, sorry, go ahead, Carrie.
I was just going to point out the 5 questions that we do have. Do you want me to go ahead and just read those out, Lacey?
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes, so let's see if we can get through at least a couple of those questions.
Okay, so I'm just going to go back, and the first one that was posted is from Nancy, and it's what 3 skills will be critical for HR professionals in the future? How is that different from the current state?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard to come down to 3, but Carrie, I wonder if you could go to, I think it's slide 23. And I'm not saying this is a complete answer. Thank you, Carrie. Perfect. Your question is really well put, Nancy. I think that the teams that we're working with, largely HR leaders, CHRO and others, are really digging into that. And as we go forward with this project, I think one of the things we're going to do is try to develop not only an answer to what 3 skills, maybe more, but also tools to get there. I would say, and I'll check and see if Ian agrees, the slide, which we can share with you, is one that the teams came up with to get at the organization of some of the skills and competencies that organizations need, but that also will need to be led by HR. And so the notion of a shift from to in the world of planning, attracting, aligning, engaging, and operational excellence is kind of what's depicted here. Ian, any comments on that?
Just one add to reinforce what we were just talking about in terms of orchestration, which is HR might lead the work, to use the terminology from John and Ravin's book, but the work won't necessarily all be done within HR or by HR people. So one of the skills, I think, is being able to be comfortable with reaching out past HR to find the right people with the right skill sets to deliver on these things that are on this chart sitting in front of you.
And that'll be a significant part of the Chicago program, actually, with Ian and Lacey in particular leading up some work on kind of personal development and how one becomes that kind of attractor, that kind of orchestra conductor leader. Thanks, Nancy.
I think that leads well into John's question, which is, we get it. How do we get our senior HR leaders to get it? They've built their careers on campfire building. How do we shift their thinking?
Yeah, that's again that's a great question with somewhat for a bit of a larger discussion. It definitely has. I'm delighted at the leadership group, and again we can share that with you that we have on the project. A lot of them are the CHROs that you were talking about, John, saying I'm looking at me, I'm looking at my organization, and I'm saying people like me need to come to this in a different way. Ravin, let you follow up on that a bit. So, John, I want to reinforce the great question. I think there is a grassroots to this. I think we can begin to build it from the inside up and begin to showcase what this looks like for leaders. But we have Ian Ziskin, a former CHRO, and Ravin, who works with many CHROs. And I want to give Ravin first and then Ian a chance to talk about that.
Sure. Thanks, John. I think the trick is in trying to build these proof points, right, of what the opportunity is. One of the things that we realized as we were writing Lead the Work was how much was actually going on out there that neither John nor David nor I even realized as it relates to how work was rapidly leaving the bounds of the organization. And I think maybe one of the key steps is I'll go back to our framework is, in the interest of, something that's tactical and tangible, it's taking a particular piece of work that you might be doing in-house, a particular pinch point, a particular pain point, and I think asking, running that job or that set of activities or that work specifically through the framework to say, how different could it be, and what specifically might be the cost and the talent implications in terms of specifically our ability to access talent that we might never have been able to get otherwise. And just as an anecdote, and I've shared this with a couple of CHROs in some events we've been doing some analysis for various organizations to say, what might work look like if we sort of think beyond employment, and just the cost numbers that sort of come back out. Setting aside what great talent you might be able to access, just the cost numbers are in the range of sort of 1/3 to 50% less than the cost of having comparable work being done by an employee. And that's just off of the direct comp and ben expenses, not even considering the cost of talent acquisition, development, et cetera. And I think some of those proof points become really important in building the case, maybe not just for sort of senior HR leaders, but perhaps more importantly, business leaders.
Ian, any thoughts or?
Oh yeah, thanks, John. Just to add one point specifically as it relates to this notion of having success with our own campfires individually. There are a lot of HR leaders that I'm encountering as a result of this future of HR work that have been historically content with their own campfire, but simultaneously quite frustrated by not being able to get more traction with their CEO, with their peers on the leadership team, in some cases with their boards, on driving some change and implementing some key initiatives that they think are important for the business going forward. And what I'm learning by interacting with all these different HR people through this project is that's where the power and the passion is. People having the willingness to share and learn from each other about what some of the new capabilities are that are going to be required in the future, getting a little bit better at those, utilizing that as a excuse, if you will, for having some dialogue with their CEO and their peers and their boards about what should be expected of HR going forward. And as a result of becoming a bit better in each of these things, a bit of promise or at least hope that we'll have an opportunity to influence some things in areas where we've been frustrated or at least slowed down in the past. And that's what's causing most people who historically had success building their own campfire to want to join in and help contribute to the bonfire, at least in my experience.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ian. And if you have additional questions that weren't addressed in the last couple of minutes of the presentation, feel free to email Carrie or myself. This is Lacey again, and we will get those questions to John, Ian, and Ravin and get back to you as soon as possible. Again, before I thank our speakers for today, I just want to remind the group that we do have the session coming up in Chicago around exactly this topic. We're really excited by this content and the amazing speakers along with our 3 hosts that are going to be hosting the session on August 25th and 26th. There are still spaces available, so feel free to visit the webpage and log in, or give us a call with questions. With that, I want to thank everyone who is on the line, and I want to particularly thank Ravin and Ian and John for leading us through a great hour. We are excited to see where this work goes. So thank you so much for your time and energy and passion around this topic.
Thanks, Lacey. Thanks, gentlemen.
Perfect. Well, thanks, everyone, and have a great day for everyone. Thanks again for joining. Bye-bye.
Thank you.